She said, "I think we can change that." A few months later, she pinned a note to my shirt. Oh, my father was so angry. He was stomping, he was yelling, he was slamming doors, but he went to the counselor anyway. When he came back, he was in a very pleasant mood. My parents told me that from now on, I wouldn't be able to drink any liquid after 3 o'clock, and that totally solved the problem. I had an immense admiration for the school counselor. I thought, it seemed obvious even to me. What goes in has to come out. Why wouldn't my parents be able to figure this out? My mother had a college education even. So I didn't get beaten in the morning, but I got beaten pretty much every afternoon anyway, or evening. Perhaps the counselor told my father that he should make sure that I always knew why I was getting punished. So sometimes he'd stop in the middle of the beating and ask me, "You know why you're being punished?" I'd say, "No." So then he would explain, "Because you're acting like a city boy." Well, it wasn't a good idea to ask my dad to explain further, but I never did understand what it was he was talking about. I used to watch the country boys when we go out to the country. I could see that there was something different, but I never could figure out exactly what it was. I often had a hard time understanding what Dad was talking about, but sometimes I figured it out. Like, for example, when I would break a window at the school. I never broke a window intentionally, but I had found that I was capable of throwing a ball just right so that it would hit the gutter. And since the playgrounds were full of kids in those days, very soon I became admired for my ability. Just a couple of inches higher, of course, and it would go into the gutter and I wouldn't see the ball again. Throw the ball just a couple of inches too low and it would hit the glass. I think Dad would usually give me a beating when I broke the window, but not a very severe beating. Not at all like when I was acting like a city kid. It never had much effect on me because the praise and respect I got from the kids on the playground outweighed the punishment. But then one day Dad didn't punish me at all. He just said, "Larry, you know when you do this you hurt the war effort." I said, "Well, why? I always pay for the glass." He said, "Yes, but if you didn't break the window, that glass could be used maybe for a fighter pilot window." I wish I could tell you that I immediately changed my behavior and never once again aimed for the gutter, but I just can't remember. What I do know is that during the last years of the war, I confined myself to throwing the ball up against the west end of the auditorium, and I never again broke a window. I also knew why I was getting slapped after Grandpa passed out in the field. I went running into the kitchen shouting, "Come quick! Grandpa's not moving, and he won't speak to me." Well, my mother and my grandmother and one of my aunts were so focused on slapping me, they couldn't understand what I was saying. When they got done slapping me, my mother said, "Now go stand in the corner until you learn some manners." So I did as I was told. After perhaps 10 or 15 minutes in the corner, my mother said, "Now tell us why you so rudely interrupted our conversation." So I told them, and they went running out and helped Grandpa, and he recovered just fine. I wish that I could say that I recovered from all my anger. It got so bad that eventually I was even hitting my sweet little sister. I really feel ashamed about that now. During the first days of the second grade, the school nurse weighed me. She looked at my chart and she said to my mother, "He hasn't gained any weight." My mom said, "You mean he hasn't gained any weight all year long?" The nurse said, "That's right." After going to a number of doctors, we wound up at Dr. Black's office. Dr. Black was very proud of the new machine that he had just gotten in from Germany. He said it was the last one that came over before we got into the war. It was called an EKG machine, an electrocardiograph. Either they didn't send a manual to explain what the squiggles on the paper meant, or else maybe Dr. Black couldn't read German, who knows. But anyway, though, he looked at it, he frowned and said, "Oh." Finally, he said to my mother, he could drop dead at any moment. Take him home immediately, put him in bed, don't let him out of bed even to eat meals. So for some 6 or 7 months during the second grade, I was stuck in bed. At first, the teachers tried to bring work home so I could keep up with the schoolwork. But during those years, the teachers were in short supply. They were going into the Army, going out to get good jobs in the defense plants. So I just laid in bed with nothing to do all day long. Then one day, Dad read in the newspaper that Dr. Black was being sued. Somebody claimed that he was a quack, and he was in the process of losing his license. That's when we went to Dr. Rising. Dr. Rising listened to my heart, said, "There's nothing wrong with this boy." Told my mother to fix fruits for me, which I dearly loved anyway, so she sent me back to school and gave me fruit salad every day when I got home. But it was too late to catch up with the rest of the kids, so I flunked second grade, had to take it again. By the second time I was in second grade, things were a little bit better. I had learned to cope with my situation by staying away from my parents as much as possible. I just lived out on the playground. And summers were wonderful. Sometimes I got to go to California, as I mentioned, work with my grandfather on the farm. My gosh, how I loved the farm. 1947, that's when we went to California. And it was after that that I started doing Kriya Yoga. Perhaps some 7 or 8 months after I started doing my Kriyas, Dad slugged me and I flew through the air and hit the wall, and I twisted while I was going through the air a little bit so that I lost my footing, fell flat on the floor. I yelled up at him, "I'm not big enough to beat you up yet, but I'm big enough to take anything you can give me." And he pulled back his foot to kick me. Well, normally I'd roll up in a ball and protect my face with my arms, but this time I just jutted out my chin so that he could get a good connection. His jaw dropped, he danced around on one foot a little bit. Then the anger mask came back onto his face and he pulled back his foot again. I just jutted out my chin further. I had no fear of death. Psychologists who study power and interpersonal relationships say that the person who wants the most from a relationship has the least power. Always before, I had wanted to live. I wanted more from the relationship than my father wanted. But by giving up the attachment to the notion that I had to live no matter what, now I had the power. Slowly, Dad put his foot down. And he just walked away. My mother was more persistent. Whenever I'd see her run for the limber rod, I'd simply run away or duck under the table. She couldn't get me. When she'd walk up to me while I was eating, I'd put my arms up and protect myself. Or sometimes I'd duck and her hand would fly into the wall. After a couple of 3 weeks of this, she showed me her arm, all the black and blue marks. She says, "I'm your mother. Why do you do this to me?" But she wasn't giving up yet. While I was eating, she snuck up very quietly behind me and then wham! So I refused to sit anywhere except with my back to the wall while I ate. Finally, my mother gave up. I was free from the beatings. My nightmares didn't end immediately, but instead they sort of morphed into something very pleasant. After my confrontation with Dad, I started having nightmares that would start scary, but then they would be very nice. I would just jump off the trestle, and I would float down like a feather. Then I started dreaming that I was flying. I'd fly through the air, and it would be such a thrill. Then after that, I had recurring dreams where there was no scary part in the beginning whatsoever. I would see myself flying over the big yard that was in front of the church. We hadn't yet built the addition. That came later. It was just a marvelous feeling, and I had that dream a long time. I suppose that an independent observer looking at my situation at that time might not have thought of me as living in a bed of roses. Even though my mother had stopped slapping me and beating me with a limber rod, she continued to scream at me, You good-for-nothing lummox, you'll never mount to a hill of beans. You good-for-nothing lummox, you'll never mount to a hill of beans. And I also had my first migraine headache just after the beating stopped. We went over to Mr. Mean's house, ate a lot of peanuts. On the way home, I said, "Oh, my head hurts." My mother said, "Where's it hurt?" And I said, "It hurts on the right side of my head." She said, "Doesn't it hurt on the other side of your head?" I said, "No." She said, "Well, that's a migraine headache. You'll probably have them the rest of your life." And so I have. I don't think I ever connected the migraine headaches to the beatings until one evening when I was meeting with my Ph.D. dissertation advisor, Harold Popinski. I had to jump up and run to the bathroom, vomit, and I came back. Dr. Popinski asked me, "Did your parents beat you when you were young?" I said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, they did." And he said, "Well, that's probably why you're having migraine headaches." Well, I went to the psychological abstracts, read everything I could on migraine headaches, read some of the articles that were referenced in the psych abstracts. Didn't find much connection at that time. That was 1965. But since then, there's been a lot of research showing that trauma does indeed produce migraine headaches. For example, among the troops leaving for Iraq, the military found that only 5% had headaches. However, during the final 3 months in Iraq, well over a third had headaches. This and other studies show that trauma does indeed produce migraine headaches, so I suppose that's why I've had migraine headaches all my life. But as far as I was concerned at the time, life was just beautiful. Now, I've been implying throughout this segment that Kriya Yoga had something to do with the sudden and dramatic improvement in the condition of my life. But if you, like me, has a somewhat skeptical turn of mind, you're probably asking, well, is it really true?